Hi guys, so today I'm going to explain to you a hip flexor stretch. There are two positions that we can take with this depending on the knee pressure that it gives you. We're going to start with a kneeling lunge position. For this you may want some extra padding, so you might want to roll the edge of your mat to create a little bit of cushioning. We're going to bring our knees onto that rolled edge. We're in 4-point kneeling. Now we're going to switch on the T-zone in this position and draw the shoulder blades down. We're going to bring one foot between the hands. Don't worry if it isn't elegant. It never looks elegant. Now you want to make sure to begin with that your toes are slightly forwards of your fingers in this position. You can see both my shin and my arm are more or less in 90. So if I walk my toes forwards, you can now see more of my shin behind my arm here, and this knee is no longer in 90, it's in a slightly greater angle range. Taking a breath in, and on the exhale we're going to push our hands into our thigh and lift ourselves upright. Now we want to start with ribs over hips, and we want to remain as tall and in neutral spine as possible. From this position you want to make sure you float your sternum and there's no tension through your neck or shoulders. Now you're actually stretching the back leg front of the hip joint, and in order to do this we need to first square the hips off, and that might mean that you drop this front hip to bring your hips into a level position, and you squeeze the glute max of your back leg. So with my hand on my back glute max, I'm going to squeeze the glute, and with the pressure through my hand I'm going to push my tailbone down to lengthen my lumbar spine, and now I can feel that my stretch is not just here in the thigh, it's actually here, quite high up in the hip flexor. So from the front I'll show you, you drop that hip to keep the hips level, you squeeze the glute and draw the tailbone down using the pressure through your hand, and here you've got your hip flexor stretch, beginning quite high up in the origin of the hip flexor, the hip itself. Good, that's just the first part of the stretch. If this is very strong, just stay here and breathe, keeping the chest upright for 5 to 10 breaths. To make your stretch bigger, keep the glute engaged and drawing the tailbone down. You can gently bring the weight forwards so you align your knee now over your leg at that 90-degree position that you began with when your hands were on the ground or on the mat. You want to make sure that you're keeping this little draw down of your tailbone to keep you in a small range of a posterior pelvic tilt, and here you're stretching the hip flexor, adding more intensity to that workload. Again, you could bring your knee a little bit further forwards, but be careful of the knee range here, particularly with the workload on the hamstring and through the ankle itself. If the heel starts to lift off, you've lost the range through your ankle mobility and you need to bring the knee back. You can get a big stretch just by staying, holding and breathing with the tailbone drawn down. To add in small ranges of rotation, we'll get those diagonal hip flexors. You can rest the same side front leg hand on the inside of your thigh. Take a deep breath in, keeping the pressure down through the tailbone and the glute on. You can rotate the chest gently away. So as you turn the chest away, you should now feel that these diagonal hip flexing ranges are what you're stretching now. You can hold this again for 5 to 10 breaths before returning to the center. You can also move diagonally across the body, and you'll notice that you're getting more of an oblique stretch running from rib to hip here. Whatever you do, make sure that you keep the sternum floating, the pelvis level, and you in a small range of posterior pelvic tilt to keep the hip flexor stretching. Once you've finished, you return your chest over your hips. Bring your weight back by lunging back through that front knee. You can bring yourselves back down to your child's pose to rest before you exchange sides. So hip flexor stretching is quite complex. There is a group of muscles that you're stretching here. It shouldn't just be felt in the thigh, the quadricep. It should be felt quite high up in the psoas, which is actually higher than the hip. It originates here, runs across the hip joint itself, and the iliacus, which is lower. So if that position does not suit the pressure on your kneecaps, you can add in a foam roller or the use of a chi ball or quite a thick, dense towel. That will give you a little bit of a different stretch, but still working the hip flexors. So for this stretch, I'm going to utilise a foam roller. I'm going to bring myself to lay down on the mat and position the foam roller behind my pelvis. Now it's really important that it is behind your pelvis, not your lower back. So as you bring the foam roller down, I'm going to add pressure onto the foam roller itself, and I'm going to bring my pelvis onto the foam roller as I lie myself down. Now I know that the foam roller needs to be directly underneath my belt line, and I know my lumbar spine is not resting on this foam roller or chi ball. We're going to keep the knees bent to support ourselves. Your hands could rest either side of the foam roller if you're worried about it rolling away from you. You want to make sure there's no tension in your shoulders or your neck, and if you'd like, you can elongate the back of your neck by popping a very small towel underneath that head here. You want to make sure that you've drawn your tailbone softly down, so you're floating more or less the spine in neutral. It's as if you're in a supported pelvic curl position. Ribs are softly drawn down, and you can switch on the T-zone to support you. Now just say I'm stretching this hip flexor here on this side. To begin the stretch with the T-zone on, I'm going to bring myself into a single leg tabletop position. I'm going to bring this knee towards my chest. Now as I squeeze my knee in towards my chest, I want to make sure I'm starting to draw the tailbone down the foam roller to lengthen through the lumbar spine and start to tilt the hip into a small posterior pelvic tilt. Now I'm not trying to release through the lower back, I'm trying to lengthen through the tailbone. So as the knee draws to chest, I can start to straighten out this base leg, and you can see I'm in a small range of hip extension, drawing the tailbone down, squeezing this back glute to drop my hips slightly back to come into the posterior pelvic tilt. I can squeeze the glute, breathe, draw the knee to chest, and enjoy this nice opening of hip flexor. Now if this is too much for you and you don't like this foam roller could be a rolled up towel, which will give you less distance from hips to floor, and it will be less of an intense stretch of the hip flexors. You still want to think about drawing the tailbone down and squeezing the glute on the leg of the hip flexor that you're stretching, just so that you're prepared to come into the small posterior pelvic tilt without stressing the lower back and keeping the pelvic floor and T-zone working. Once you've had enough, you want to slide your base leg back on in. You want to bring both feet back to the mat, keep the T-zone and abdominals working, and if you want to come off the foam roller, you can either slide it to the side, lifting the pelvis off and then lowering yourself down, or you can roll it out from underneath you. You can try either versions of this hip flexor stretch. I would say that the more controllable one would be the one in the lunge position, just because you're able to move from neutral spine into that small range of posterior pelvic tilt without gravity really trying to pull the pelvis back and down. On the foam roller or the chi ball, it's a little bit more intense just because the pelvis is floating and you're able to transition into posterior pelvic tilt at larger ranges due to the distance between you and the ground, depending on what object you're using. Whatever you do, you want to stay safe. So you want to make sure that you are working from a strongly engaged center. You're aware of the pressure that you're putting through the pelvic floor and the lower back, depending on the position of the pelvis. So remember, if it doesn't feel good, don't do it. I hope you enjoyed my tip and you have a good day.